Good morning, everyone. So glad you're here this morning. My name is Helen Christians, and I'll be your MC. We're here at Friendly House. We've got a really nice crowd, and we have our speaker here this morning, too. We're here this Sunday morning during Memorial Weekend. You're here at a humanist meeting, and it's a simple definition of humanism. It's a philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, motivated by compassion. It affirms the dignity and value of all humans. Humanists believe that this is the only life of which we are certain, and because of that belief, we attempt to live an honorable life. We do this for ourselves, our family, our friends, our fellow humans, and all the other living creatures with whom we share this fragile planet. Mike Boucher is going to be our reader this morning. Mike, come on in.
I'm already here.
Oh, you're already here. Hello.
Yeah.
I see you in two places.
Yeah. This is downtown Vaduz, Liechtenstein.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, but anyway, my reading is a brief excerpt of a work in progress of a graphic novel I'm working on. I figured, this would be appropriate,
Yes.
from one cartoonist to another. Hopefully I'll live up to that expectation. The plot is, aliens called Bassians have been visiting the Earth for over 500,000 years. They adopt humans as they go along. They're in modern Earth now, and they're trying to keep hidden because our technology has, really caught them by surprise. Anyway, some of the humans they brought with them, back with them, are have been taken up by a Muslim family, and they're taking them to their Islamic center in downtown in Northeast Portland. But one of the adopted humans is Taza, who was rescued from the sacking of Dibba. She's basically an Arabian pagan who survived a Muslim takeover. Anyway, Jidena here is the communications leader, and she's very fatigued about all the work she's doing. And Tushla is the team leader of the Earth people. She was one of the only two who were rescued when the camp was invaded. Anyway, I better get to the chase here. Okay, Jiden agrees to, show Taza's rescue at the time. And unfortunately, I left out one of the pages when I was transferring this. So anyway,
okay,
they show the video when Taza was rescued by them. Okay, she confesses that she killed the soldier who took over her family after killing their father and tried to convert her to Islam. And she agrees to come with the landing party. Back to modern times, they're gassed that she killed her stepfather. That revelation may have cost them their refuge, Tutla. Do you have an alternate plan? I'm thinking of one now. Okay, anyway, finally they end the transmission and or the video. Okay, yeah, there's Taza. She's seen the whole thing and she kind of had to relive it. And Ahmed, the local imam, says to her, "It's been said that the winners write the history books. Before we met you, I knew next to nothing about pre-Islam Arabian people. I admit that Islam has a share of innocent blood on their hands. So do all the world's largest religions. But today, many people in all religions reject the hate and violence of the past and want to live in peace. My family are among those people." And he's starting to win over the Bassians there. "I will not force Islam upon you, Taza. Please don't force your hatred of Islam upon us." She turns to his daughter, Jazari, and says, "Jazari, does your father let you read and write?" Because she was forbidden. "I can read and write in 3 languages." Surprises everybody else, so Taza relents. And Jidena, who's kind of wary of the humans, decides, I'm going to talk to this guy. "Ahmed, I am Jidena, leader of Bassian communication. You may use this device for translation for the duration of our guest stay." "Well, I've seen scarier things in horror movies." Ahmed, we Bastians are governed by our High Council, for which I aspire to join someday. Due to strict protocol, I cannot divulge much to you at this time. But your words to Taza resemble how a High Counselor deals with high emotions among our people. That is why I allow this communication. We put great trust that you will keep our guests' presence secret until we may retrieve them. Oh, I definitely will. Because, well, to be honest, if Taza's presence is discovered, this could turn into a crisis that would be too much for us to handle. And Tushla says, we share your overwhelming, Mr. Al-Makana. She mentions Reverend Graves, who's the villain, this whole thing. And Jones says, oh, he's a horrible man. Every time he mentions Islam, his followers harass us and vandalize our property. Bastians, we are your allies. And so everything's all good between them. It'll be the ultimate test of my communication skills to justify this. How will we explain this to Mom? Please, Jazari, one crisis at a time. That's it.
Thank you, Mike. The drawings are beautiful.
I forgot to put them on full screen. I'm sorry.
No, we can see them.
Okay, that's good.
No, they're beautiful.
Okay.
And you did all those, right? This is yours.
All of it.
Beautiful. I love the colors.
Oh, thank
Just
you.
great. Well done, my friend.
Okay.
And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Gus Frederick is a third-generation freethinker and native Oregonian. He works as a conceptual artist, photographer, filmmaker, and animator. For decades, he has been researching interesting stories from his local community in Silverton County. Today, he will be telling us about Homer Davenport, who was Oregon's first media superstar.
Oh,
Welcome, Gus. And you'll be taking questions at the end, am I correct? Sounds
questions at
good.
the end.
All right.
Share screen. There we go. And boom. Can you see me now? Hear me now? Here, yeah. Anyway, like she said, I'm Gus Frederick from Silverton. Actually, I was born in Salem. That's my dirty little secret. Raised in Beaverton, and I got some childhood friends in the audience here. But today we're going to talk about Homer Davenport, Oregon's first media superstar. So Homer Davenport, who was Homer Davenport? 1867, 1912, was a cartoonist, journalist, lecturer, and Arabian horse breeder, among other things, which I'll introduce later on. He was born just south of Silverton, about in the Waldo Hills, and was, at the age of about 7, he moved to Silverton with his family, and his father set up a store, and that kind of set the whole story straight. And his father was a well-known guy, and I tell people we celebrate every Homer Davenport Days. It's the only festival in Oregon that I'm aware of that celebrates a political cartoonist. But if Homer hadn't been born, we would have been celebrating Timothy Woodbridge Davenport Days, because he was known as the sage of Silverton, and wrote extensively about Oregon's first half century of statehood from a progressive standpoint. And I got one of my books here. You can check that out later. His writings, he wrote extensively in the Oregon Historical Quarterly at the first decade of its existence. His mother was Florinda Gear, the daughter of other pioneers from that period, Ralph and Mary Gear. And she basically, according to family legend, when she was pregnant, decided to, born a genius. She was a big fan of Thomas Nast, and so she, I'm gonna move right along here. She decided that, well, I'm gonna have born a genius. I want to, how do you do that? And there was a doctor that, anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Here's a couple of shots of this. Before Homer was born, he had a sister that was there, and then two other siblings that died in the diphtheria epidemic in the early 1860s. Little Johnny and Ole. Orla was the only one that survived that and grew up, and Homer came along years later. Now, like I said, Florinda was a big fan of Thomas Nast, who was a big cartoonist for the Harper's Weekly magazine. And even in Pioneer, Oregon, they apparently received the Harper's Weekly magazine. We know Thomas Nast from many different things, but today he's probably most recognized as the inventor of our common picture of Santa Claus, because he illustrated the original Night Before Christmas story. This kind of image of Santa Claus, the jolly old elf, comes from his Germanic heritage. He was born in Germany, but he was quite the cartoonist. Also invented the Republican elephant as a power animal symbol. Some people claim he got the donkey too, but he didn't. This donkey over here was, unrelated to that. That came by another cartoonist who I forgot his name, pre-Civil War. But the Republican vote, the third term panic was referring to the potential of Ulysses S. Grant running for an unprecedented third term. And then Boss Tweed, of course, was the big guy that ran the Tammany, the Democratic controlled machine of New York, Tammany Hall. And Nast's cartoons pretty much brought him down, because even though there were many editorials, he was, Tweed was noted for saying that, stop them damn pictures, because, my people can't read, but they can see the pictures. So anyway, he was sentenced to Sing Sing, escaped, went to Spain, and this picture, someone recognized him from this Nast cartoon and thought he was a child molester and reported him to the authorities, and they extradited him back, and he died in prison. So anyway, like I said, Dr. Russell Thatcher Thrall was a hydropathic physician in this period of time. He was one of those newfangled physicians that noted that if you tended to wash your hands before you operated on people, the survival rate tended to be higher. But he supposedly, and I haven't been able to find it yet, wrote a paper titled "How to Born a Genius." Basically, have the conception happen during broad daylight, eat only vegetables, vegan diet, and, drink plenty of water, blah, blah, blah. And so this is what Florinda did when she was pregnant. She was going to born another Thomas Nast, was her idea. Here's a number of his books I downloaded off of the Google Books, great resource, I might add. This one over here, Sexual Physiology, got him in trouble with the Comstock Act, because even though it's a strictly medical journal, Comstock deemed it pornographic. Comstock wasn't a government employee, by the way. He was the self-appointed censor of the Mail. Anyway, Florinda died of smallpox when Homer was just 3.5 years old. And supposedly on her deathbed, she made her husband, T.W., promise to encourage Homer's artwork, because he's going to be another cartoonist. And don't make him work in the field and all this other stuff like all the other boys. I want him, he's going to grow up and be special. And he took her to heart. And after Florinda died, he remarried, moved to Silverton, as Homer Wiley put it. So the influence of the Latin Quarter would influence my artistic capabilities, he says years later. But this is Main Street in Silverton. Those of you who listened to my previous talk on the Oregon infidels may recognize this image. That building on the right with the phrase universal mental liberty is interesting, because Silverton, for the most part, was founded by freethinkers in the 1850s. This was Liberal Hall, where they used to have meetings, and where the Liberal University was initially started. Today, it's an excellent restaurant called Oso's Mediterranean Fare. But anyway, I digress. This is a nice picture I found stuck in the back of our file cabinet at the Oregon Country Historical Society. It was very faded, but I was able to scan it in and through Photoshop to bring out the contrast, and found this is the Silverton Trombone Band, which Homer wrote about in his autobiography, The Country Boy. I mean, he had a very much of a self-depreciating, way of referring to himself. He was, a loser, blah, 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 but he was actually quite a styling dude. This is him on the left here with his bowler hat and tie. He hadn't got his uniform yet, like all the other guys. And this is another photo of him earlier from comparison. He later on in life grew a mustache that became kind of his predominant feature. Here's another shot of the band. The top one was when Grover Cleveland came to town, and one of the bankers, Jake McLean, paid for the band to go and perform for Cleveland and Portland, because Jake supposedly was the only Democrat in Silverton and helped fund the band, bought all the instruments, bought the uniforms, paid for the train. It was like a 6-hour train trip from Silverton, shifting different trains, and they ended up playing for Cleveland. And that's accounted in Davenport's book as well. This is another shot of the same band years later, standing in front of the Oddfellows building, which now is a kind of a cutesy boutique place for garden stuff, but the building's still there. This is, again, Homer on the left. He played the snare drum. And there's the band picture, and then here's a picture from the country boy of the band heading up to Portland. This is Homer's new mother-in-law, or stepmother rather, and the other 4 kids that came in after Homer when they got married. He had a brother, half-brother, Timothy Jr., Timothy Clyde, who had passed away. Apparently got kicked in the abdomen by a goat in his youth, and he had died before this photo was taken. But his other 4 sisters here kind of kept going. Alice and Mary Dell especially were the keepers of the family archives. The Davenport family is interesting in that they're a family of letter writers, and they tended to save all the letters, which for history nerds like myself was just invaluable. And those are all down in the Knight Library at U of O. One of Homer's first jobs, albeit not really a paying gig, was more of a volunteer thing, was as a cartoonist for the Oregonian. And looking through some different archives, a guy up here, I forgot his name, but he had gone and Xeroxed everything relating to Homer from the archives of the library. And this one piece came in really interesting because it has Oregon game fish, speckled beauties in every lake, and he was not credited. There was no Homer Davenport did this, or even an HD, which he used later on, but it was just illustrations. So the only clue that I have is the central fish, the Abaquaw beauty, which someone from the area would recognize. Oh, Abaquaw Creek runs right by Silverton. So Homer was known for fishing, and so he obviously threw this in as kind of a homage to the folks back home, if you will. His big gig started when he went to the Sunday Mercury newspaper, which was called a sporting paper at the time, emphasis on athletics and things of that nature. And the Dempsey Fitzsimmons middleweight bout was going to happen. Now, Jack Dempsey, this is Jack Dempsey non-Pariel, the original Jack Dempsey, lived in Portland at the time. And he was of Irish descent. And he was in a fight, this, Ruby Robert Fitzsimmons in New Orleans. Homer brashly came into the office of the Mercury and say, pay for my ticket and I'll illustrate this thing for you. Because back then, illustrators, cartoonists and whatnot were like human cameras. Photographic reproduction was still coming into its own, and it was still rather expensive. So yeah, they'd hire artists to go down and document the stuff in pictures. Anyway, he went down there. Again, he wrote about this in the Country Boy. It's quite a humorous story. In the January 15th, taking the train through Chicago or through Colorado and on down to New Orleans. Turned out that Dempsey lost to Fitzsimmons, and the banner he was supposed to unfurl, he ended up trading it for a baby alligator. And then on the way back on the train, they got into Colorado, the alligator froze solid, and he accidentally dropped it and broke it in half. So I love it. This is all with his stories. It's like I said, he's pretty self-depreciating. Anyway, that was kind of an interesting thing, but it got the attention of the family because when he came back to Silverton, he was, back to his job was engine wiper, cleaning off the oil and grease off of, the locomotive trains that had just been established going through the whole Oregon country. Turns out that T.W., Timothy, Homer's father, had some rather influential cousins. the Smith brothers, not these Smith brothers, but this is the great graphic. I love it because they did both have beards. Charles Warren Smith was kind of like the Lee Iacocca of failing railroads. He was brought in when the railroad was going, bankrupt or whatever, to turn it around. Then he'd move on to the next one. He and his brother William grew up with TW in Ohio before the Davenport family got the Oregon fever and emigrated in the early 1850s. But they stayed in touch and were quite, friendly with one another. Apparently, according to Davenport, both of senior and junior, Charles Warren Smith was coming through Silverton on his private Pullman car and wanted to know if he could visit his cousin TW. So he does, and TW, shows him some of Homer's cartoons. And he says, well, this guy is pretty good. I should send him back to Brother William. Now, Brother William is kind of interesting because he was a co-founder of the Associated Press, Western Division out of Chicago, which eventually merged with the regular Associated Press out of New York. But he apparently took these images that he had drawn of these characters in New Orleans back with him and showed them to his brother, William, the AP guy. And according to Davenport, he said, you got to come and meet my cousin and don't be late. This guy is very important. And he says, he looks at the picture and he says, he doesn't have to work for the rail. Homer was expecting to be promoted to engineer, which was his main ambition at the time. And he said, well, no, here's, he ends up getting a letter of introduction to Hearst's new San Francisco Examiner, a new paper that had just started up several years ago by this brash young Californian whose father won it in a poker game. Anyway, William Henry Smith served as Ohio Secretary of State and some other little appointed things through, through President Hayes. He's a big Hayes supporter. His nephew, C.W. Fairbanks, acquired the Indianapolis News with him, and Fairbanks, named after Uncle Charlie Warren Fairbanks, Smith, ended up becoming vice president under Theodore Roosevelt. And he was also senator from Indianapolis, Indiana. And this is their Historical Society Museum in Indianapolis. Turned out there's a lot of interesting Davenport connections to this. And I had a Navy buddy of mine I was stationed in Iceland with that lives in Indianapolis. And he mentioned, oh yeah, if you want to come out and stay with us, Turns out that the guy that ran the museum or the archives was their best man at their wedding. So I had kind of an in there, so it kind of came together. One of the things that I found out was that, yes, he got this letter of introduction to Hearst to work in the art department of the San Francisco Examiner as a, caricaturist. But when he shows up, Hearst was gone. He was off to Europe buying statues or whatever. And the regular people in the art department said, well, we got this letter, he says we got to give him a job. So they gave him a job, and they didn't like his work. So they basically fired him. And he went to work instead for M.H.D. Young, who ran the San Francisco Chronicle, the rival paper. They initially recognized his talent as a caricaturist and started employing him to do that. And I've recently come, some interesting, reprints of that newspaper, showing some of Davenport's early work. It's kind of interesting. But then he abruptly says he was fired, but I doubt that. Quit, and all of a sudden now he's working for the Chicago Herald during the World's Columbian Exposition, the World's Fair of Chicago, 1893. The White City, if you will. This is where he supposedly first got his taste of Arabian horses, saw them. There's a 40-some head of Arabian horses were sent over by the Ottoman Empire for this as part of the Turkish exhibit at this fair. And they eventually were repossessed because they didn't get paid their bill to house the horses, and someone tried to burn down the barn, and half the horses got killed in that, and the others ended up getting sold off at auction. Davenport himself ended up with several years later through Arabian horse aficionados. But at this point, he just saw these and was just enamored by the Arabian horse physique. And this is his quote from his second book of recollections, My Quest to the Arabian Horse. And he says, however, in Chicago, just before the opening of that World's Fair, the Arab germs in my system got a fresh start. So also during this time, he ends up becoming engaged and married to Miss Daisy Moore, who was kind of a debutante from San Francisco. He had dated briefly, but really didn't want to have a long-term relation with. But somehow she ends up, Davenport family lore says she follows him to Chicago. And basically says, let's get married. Homer apparently says, well, I don't think we're compatible. And then she goes to cousin William Smith and says, I'm with child. And they hastily arrange a marriage on the train back to the West Coast. And their first son was born 2.5 years later. So that kind of set the stage for that relationship. But anyway, the connection with Miss Daisy Moore's is kind of interesting. It turns out that her brother was one of the biographers of Stevenson when Stevenson was living in Samoa, and wrote this account of with Stevenson in Samoa and talking about how he was serving it. This is when the United States still claimed it, and so he wrote in the introduction to this book that he visited the Columbian Exposition in 1893 as part of this contingent from Samoa. And I'm assuming, and this is pure assumption, that he stopped by and visited the family in San Francisco on the way, because Samoa ship, boom, San Francisco, and then takes a train back. And, oh, can I go with you, brother? My boyfriend's in Chicago. So I'm guessing that's why Daisy, quote, followed Homer to Chicago. I think she went along with her brother, but that's just a guess. But who knows? Anyway, Homer came back after that, married now, got a job back with the Chronicle, which led me to believe that he wasn't fired the first time, but actually quit because he probably had some connection with the Smith families. And now he's back with that. And they had kind of a World's Fair light that they promoted in San Francisco in January in 1894, primarily bankrolled by DeWolf and the Chronicle newspaper, although the Examiner was there hot and heavy too. Anyway, Hearst came back from Europe by this time and was looking at the Chronicle and seeing all this work that Homer had been doing. And he basically goes to his art department and says, how come this guy's not working for us? And they grudgingly say, well, he wasn't any good, so we fired him. Well, they hired him back, and these are all the images of Hearst. At the time, 1890s, he was actually very analogous to, still not advancing here. Oh, come on. William Randolph Hearst at this period of time, when I was growing up, he was, Patty's grandpa, and kind of a notorious rascal from Citizen Kane, all that stuff. But during this period of time, he was more analogous to Stephen Jobs, a very innovative, young, brash guy with a lot of money, or Elon Musk, I guess, for that analogy to carry that forward. So he was really into printing reprographics and eagerly adopted Homer's style and his characterization and had him working on that. And then in 1895, went back to New York, found a struggling newspaper, the New York Evening Journal, bought it and transferred a number of his key people, Davenport included, back east to set up this paper. And this is another little Davenport dropping I found in Indianapolis with my buddy Mark. We had one day left, so we went to Richmond, Indiana, which was the birthplace of recorded jazz, Jeanette Records and all that. That was kind of neat. But we went to the Historical Society, and he points out this cartoonist's work, and he says, look at this, kind of like your guy Davenport. And I started searching into John McCutcheon, which is the name of the cartoonist, boom, and find this letter that was written by Homer to him in 1895, saying, hey, I'm surprised to see that I'm in New York now, blah, 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 blah. Apparently he had made friends with him during the World's Fair, and now is offering him a job. Hearst was notorious for poaching people from other areas and other newspapers and whatnot. So he says, anyone you know, tell them we'll hire him, whatever. And so this is the offer that Homer sent in under Hearst's direction. Basically, he did not bite, but these letters were in the archives at the McCutcheon papers in Chicago, because he was kind of known as the dean of political cartoonists many years, very successful. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But his stuff is great cartoonist, incredible stuff. And like I said, Hearst was a big innovator, especially in reprographics, and was behind the development of a number of different new printing presses and things of that nature. He and Pulitzer went to war against each other, trying to perfect the Sunday funnies. Eventually it was 2-color, and then it finally doing a 4-color process. And this is one of the exotic printing presses that Hearst was instrumental in hiring the R. Hohen Company to build this thing for the journal, and as well as some of the other papers that he worked for. Now, during this time, 1897, Homer published his first book, just called Cartoons by Davenport, which were just 86 various cartoons that appeared in the New York Journal with just their captions. And so I annotated that. I got copies here. You can see that later. And made the annotated cartoons, which goes through and describes each of the cartoons, who are the people, what are the issues, and kind of enlightening it. Because when I first saw this book, it was a coffee table sized book. My then girlfriend's father had one. I go, this is incredible. How come I've never heard of this guy before? Now, here's another political cartoonist of the period, Joseph Ferdinand Kepler, worked primarily for Puck magazine. And he did a lot of color work. But what's interesting is this hat on this guy. This is William Harrison, President William Harrison. He was the president between two Cleveland administrations. And you'll notice a big hat, oversized hat on his head. This is kind of like a cartoonist gag that they always use on specific people. Up here is James G. Blaine overlooking him. And the idea is this is grandpa's hat, and it's too big. It doesn't fit within him, because his father was an earlier President Harrison that had died in office, I think only a couple of months or so. Anyway, Homer translated that whole big hat thing and used it himself. And so here's a shot of John Sherman, who from Indianapolis or Indiana, Ohio, and saying that he won't run, is honoring Muncies, blah, blah, blah. It's just leading up to the 1896 presidential election. This is the cover shot referencing the great Venezuelan border dispute from 1895. I'm sure everyone is aware of that one. It's one of those Monroe Doctrine threats that we were threatening Great Britain here, and these are all the targets in the back. He's getting the new gun, the old gun ready. 1776, 1812, and here's the target coming up for Venezuela. Well, it never went anywhere. And this is one of my favorite cartoons. Mark Hanna, Dollar Mark Hanna, they called him, because he had, Homer drew little dollar marks in his suit. And this is Mr. Hanna's stand on the labor question. And just biting incredible things. Hannah supposedly hated it. I like your work, most of it's funny, but that really hurt. That labor on the skull really hurt. Here's another shot of Hannah, and they just were ruthless on him. Oh, Davenport was. He's, I'm confident the working men are with us, and there they are, the farmers in the back, and he's got his feet up on a pile of campaign funds, all relevant, and he's the campaign manager, head of RNC during 1896 campaign. Here's McKinley, just a small little guy here on the watch bob, so he's kind of insignificant to the big moneyed interests of Dollar Mark Hanna. And this money right here, 118,000 notes, references the amount of debt that Hanna bought so McKinley could run, because he was in debt to various people for that amount of money. And Hanna, a rich industrialist, says, "Oh, I'll cover that." And so that's what it is. And there's a nice shot of what the actual pictures of those guys look like. So he's pretty close to getting them. And here's yet another cartoon showing that 118,000 old account done a year or so later. Now, Davenport met with Hannah after this election and later on over the years before he died, and they ended up becoming friends. So it's kind of ironic, you know, I mean, the vitriol in some of these cartoons, but yet they still got along. This is kind of interesting. In the 1897 or 1897 annex or New York election, where they're going to reunite all the various boroughs into one greater New York City that we have today, Davenport again was attacking a lot of these folks here. And the New York Assembly had an anti-cartoon bill supposedly introduced. And here we have Boss Tweed, who is a senator from New York, who also was the head of the Republican National Committee of New York, or the Republican Committee of New York, with a bayonet, threatening the governor of New York, Mr. Black, and the Tammany Hall guy here, Richard Stoker, with the anti-cartoon gag. And it's kind of like the joke is, you know, yeah, that's the press, it won't go anywhere. Here's another shot here. All these people, this is really fun. These are all prominent politicians, including Homer's second cousin, Fairbanks, crying because these men, how bad will these men feel when they pass anti-cartoon bill, you know, to expose the public trust. And it's great. And here's the title of the show today, the coup de grace, the anti-cartoon bill. No honest man need fear cartoons. And so Davenport's got a reproduction of Boss Tweed next to Boss Platt with a big boodle bag of money. And this is the actual text of the anti-cartoon bill. I contacted the New York Historical Society, and they were able to, you know, send me a Xerox copy of the original bill. So it's to restrain the unauthorized printing and publishing of portraits or alleged portraits of individuals, you know. And so there's all this stuff, blah blah blah. Even then, it was determined to be totally unconstitutional, so it died, probably not even in committee. But again, here's Davenport, drew it again. Now the anti-cartoon bill is like a dead cat thrown into the trash heap with Governor Black in the background laughing. So, and this is kind of interesting because back in the day, newspapers often employed staffs of cartoons. And this is when the Spanish-American War started up, and Charles Bartholomew, a cartoonist from Minnesota, drew all these political cartoonists interviewing Uncle Sam, you know, and he's overworked was the caption. And here's Homer's portrait down here on the side with a New York Journal visor on. And then from that book, from a number of different things, he was really into, you know, talking about the visual puns. And I like this one particularly because, you know, some of these, you wonder how long they went. The Mighty Hunter, this is Grover Cleveland contemplating a third run, but he doesn't because he's now a lame duck. So that's kind of neat. And then House Speaker Reed, whose presidential boom went bust because he was planning on running for president as well before McKinley came in. And so he's trying to decide if he wants to be second fiddle or not. And then we have Senator Spooner from Wisconsin in the background, Dollar Mark Hanna, and looks like Senator Dingley from Maine, and he's being buttonholed by Dollar Mark Hanna. So, and then The Bitter Pill by Seth Low. Seth Low is a progressive Republican from New York, was running for mayor. They had him as a little baby elephant, the Citizens Union, they called it. And him being the GOP boss, doesn't want to take that bitter pill, and eventually, you know, supported the Tammany Hall, or supported somebody else in Tammany Hall, rigged the election anyway, and they won. And then Joseph Choate in the Law. This is kind of fun because of the background figures over here, especially. Woo, there's another Homer. So I thought that was kind of neat. Wow, looks like he's predating, you know, Greening here. But he wasn't just a cartoonist and a caricaturist. He was also a pretty good artist as well, and as a journalist. Hearst sent him to France to cover the second trial of Alfred Dreyfus, who was charged with treason. And as you can see, these images, they're very realistic, you know, not cartoony at all. And then he wrote the account as well. He obviously had editors because he was a notorious speller, but didn't have spell check back then. And this is one of the more gripping things from the Spanish-American War was over. We went in to help the freedom fighters in the Philippines to get rid of the yoke of Spain. We did that, and then all of a sudden they're insurrectionists, and we were trying to keep the Philippines for ourselves. And this is one famous general, Jacob H. Smith, that says, kill everyone over 10, supposedly. So to stop the insurrection, kill them young. And this was on the front page of the New York Journal and the Examiner. So another Homer cartoon. And this is another one. This appeared in the Oregonian in one of Homer's trips back to Oregon periodically. So here he is sitting in Wolford's store, with all these different people around here, and he's got them labeled, Hubbard right here, he's 6'6". So he has him towering over everyone out. And then he's got his father over here. And his father's kind of got this smug face because he took a lot of heat when Homer was growing up for Homer being too lazy and not working like the rest of the boys. So it's like, see, I told you this guy would turn out to be something with this smug look. You got the mayor over here. That's the mayor. And then the chief of police over here. But here's a picture of those actual people. Another trip when Homer came back, when his father was getting close to death, they saw it, but he ended up living another 10 years. But here's the mayor, 6'6" mayor, and then the sheriff, and then two of Homer's uncles, John Davenport and Joe Davenport. He died a couple of years after this picture was taken. John was a personal friend of Chief Joseph, in fact, in Colville, and worked with the Native Americans extensively during his career. And then Thomas Nast statue. The other question I always had, because their careers and lifespans overlap, did he ever meet Thomas Nast? I contacted the Nast historic people, and they said, well, they weren't letter writers, so they had nothing, a reference to that. But the only thing I came closest was this: after his death by yellow fever in Ecuador, Davenport talked to the Morristown, New Jersey, where the Nast lived. Homer lived just 3 miles away in Morristown, or I forgot the other one, East Morristown. And he, at this lecture, proposed making a Davenport, Thomas Nast statue, and he would be more than happy to donate some of the money from his lectures towards that end. But whether or not he actually met him, I don't know. This is his second book that came out of collection of cartoons, The Dollar of the Man, and it was primarily just 50 cartoons this time, focused on the anti-corruption, antitrust, the corporate excess type stuff that we know Davenport for nowadays. And this had an introduction by Horace Trumbull, who happened to be the biographer of Walt Whitman. And some of the more powerful pictures than that, this one I think is incredible: arbitration in the strike. So we got the rich plutocrat beating the heck out of this poor worker, and the family in the background kind of looking on. And then Theodore Roosevelt came into view at this time, with Davenport, because he was always opposing him when he was working for Hearst. And this is kind of fun, the pool of popularity. So Teddy Roosevelt's becoming more popular, and then Dollar Mark Hanna wants to get in on that, so he's taking the Rough Rider outfit and trying to put it on, but it doesn't fit. So it's pretty funny. And then here's the Teddy Roosevelt and McKinley running for the second term, which leading people on. Here's the Theodore Roosevelt on the top with McKinley again. And I like this one here. Same arc, they won't leave anything in that but holes. So during this period of time, he was pretty much anti-Roosevelt. And, Roosevelt, noticed that. And he kind of held grudges and, forgave people too over the years. But this one was kind of interesting. The White House has been changed. This is a Davenport cartoon showing the White House now. The state dining room has got all the, trophies of, various hunts from Teddy Roosevelt, who was known for his big game hunting skills. And this is what Homer wrote in this article: if Mr. Roosevelt cannot enjoy his meals except in the presence of the stuffed remains of his victims, it would have been better to decorate his private dining room with them instead of bringing such horrors into the state dining room. You know, and and it was kind of ironic because here's the actual state dining room. There's three, I think. So it wasn't quite as bad as he was leading it to believe. Nevertheless, Roosevelt was not amused because maybe a month or so earlier than that, Homer sent this letter to Roosevelt himself. My dear President, my letter reads from our mutual friend, Honorable Thomas Carter, the senator from Montana. I find that you are greatly interested in our prospect to stock Yellowstone Park with such game birds as would thrive in that climate. I mean, never mind the introducing alien species. But anyway, he figured that Roosevelt would love this thing. Well, Roosevelt did not. This is actually from the Roosevelt archives, a letter to dear Senator Carter. Do you recollect speaking to me about Homer Davenport and the pheasants? You know, if you turn to the Examiner on May 31st, you'll shows him to be a slanderer and a liar, and I out of the question for me to have any dealings with him whatsoever. I'm going, okay. Anyway, not shortly after that, Davenport again went, or Hearst again went to Europe, and Davenport quit. He abruptly quit Hearst. And I think that that was probably the thing that got him towards that is, yeah, I'm sure that Hearst forced him to write this state dining room letter or article, primarily because Hearst was a very vocal vegan at the time. In fact, later in San Simeon, his own private zoo, was kind to animals and all this, which seemed kind of, anachronistic to his personality, but there you go. Anyway, Homer ended up working for the lecture circuit of Major James Pond, who ran people like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Samuel Clemens and others on this lecture circuit. There's a big, deal for people to go around and listen to people talk. Imagine that. Oops. Let me get rid of this thing. There we go. Anyway, he and Roosevelt really hit it off. And when Roosevelt ended up, because he's now the president, running for president on his own terms, Davenport did this cartoon. He's good enough for me. Again, kind of a realistic expression with Uncle Sam with his hand on Teddy's shoulder, and it became one of those cartoonist memes like Grandpa's hat. So here's the RNC really jumped on that. Buttons were made, pamphlets were made. Here, when he ran again in 1912, he's good enough for me again. Good enough for me, March. This blew me away. Sheet music based on a Homer Davenport cartoon. And the Roosevelt archives have that. So I'm trying to find some musicians that could like to perform it for me so I can record that. Because I'm working on a Davenport biopic. So I think that'd be kind of neat to include that. Oh, wait a minute. I'm clicking in the wrong areas of this stupid thing. Anyway, that meme, good enough for me, was transposed and used by other cartoonists. Here's Teddy Roosevelt. He's good enough for me with Gifford Pinchot. Gifford Pinchot, he's good enough for me. In England, even, he's good enough for me. John Bull, who is the Uncle Sam equivalent of Great Britain, with P.M. Chamberlain, who's the father of Neville Chamberlain. He's good enough for me. And then, of course, she's good enough for me. Votes for women. Women's suffrage movement made these little postcards. It's pretty cool. And then again, he's good enough for me with Hitler, during 1930s. And down here, it even says after Davenport. So he gave Homer credit. He's the only one. But wait, there's more. He's good enough for me. And even he's good enough for me in 68, Richard Nixon. So it's kind of funny how those things kind of go through. Anyway, 1903 was the Lewis and Clark Exposition here in this neck of the woods, in fact. And Homer had his own little gig going, the Davenport Farm. And this is a cartoon that he drew of, en route to, to the trail on the Oregon, the Lewis and Clark Exposition. Of course, he had it all on a train. They didn't walk. But here's a map of the thing. And if you zoom in a little bit, you see this little small area, Davenport Farm Exhibit. And people came to that, off and on. Supposedly they lived in this log cabin, him and Daisy and the kids. Here he is with poet of the Sierras, Joaquin Miller, and they had these little photographic fake backgrounds and stuff like that. He didn't actually live on site all the time, so I'm sure, you know, she wouldn't have got up with that. Well, here's Homer's three kids, and sitting on one of the Arabian horses that he had bought from the survivors of the exposition, Chicago exposition. He eventually went to Arabia and brought back more later, but that's a different story. Anyway, he got interviewed by Pacific Monthly and was kind of lamenting the fact that how many of his people that come to visit mistook him for the help. You know, tell Mr. Davenport I'm here. I'm a very good friend of his. Well, I am Mr. Davenport. Anyway, so Roosevelt's in the White House, you know, after this whole thing, and Homer received this letter from Teddy Roosevelt, because basically, you know, Roosevelt apparently said, "What can I do for you? You got me elected with this cartoon, blah, blah, blah." He said, "Well, you know, I always wanted to go to Arabia and bring back purebred Arabian horses and start a line of Arabian horses." He convinced Roosevelt of this by saying that, well, the cavalry these would be perfect for the cavalry horses, you know, because they're desert horses, blah, blah, blah. Never mind, you know, mechanization was already happening. But anyway, my dear Davenport, you want anything you want, I should like to do anyhow. And when it comes to dealing with Arabian horses, I would take you up with double zeal. Is the enclosed letter from the Secretary of State all right? If not, make what changes you wish, and I will have them put in. You can use this letter too with any of our representatives. With all good luck, faithful yours, Roosevelt. So obviously he did have some dealings with him later on, and you know, made it clear the way for him to go to the Ottoman Empire, originally to bring back 8 purebred heads of mares and stallions, but they ended up bringing back 27. His book, My Quest of the Arabian Horse, documents all that. He went with 2 other guys that were also Arabian horse aficionados. One was a photographer. So they really documented the thing. And they met this guy, Sheikh Ahmed Hafez. Let me see if we can get the stupid thing to go away. Anyway, they made a diplomatic blunder when they got to Aleppo and visited this guy, who was the attaché to the Ottoman Empire to the Bedouin tribes of the area, who were basically at this point very similar in form and function to, you know, Native Americans here, being dispersed and all that stuff. And so this guy was in charge of that. But they had the governor, the Ottoman governor, who was the person they should have went to first. Well, he went to this guy first, these crazy Americans, because he was supposedly knew who had the best horses. And he was just immediately, wow, this is big faux pas on your guys' part, but, you know, I'm really grateful. So here, you can have my prized mare, you know, Waduda. So he gives this war mare to Davenport right then and there for coming to him first instead of the Ottoman. They hated the Ottoman Empire. So over the course of, this is Aleppo again. It doesn't look like this at all. This is the marketplace. You know, the ISIS pretty much smashed that place to whatever. Here's Homer with some of the Arabs that he was trading. They hit it off really well. The Arab Bedouins, you know, I think they admired the fact that these gringos showed up in the middle of summer when it was incredibly hot. And it was like July, August. And so they took him around. Some of the photos that Homer's fellow traveler was with, you know, and then putting on horseshoes on the Arabian horses. It was an incredible book. I might check that out. So with the 27 heads that they brought back, let's see if I can get this to go away. They ended up shipping them all back to America. This is in Naples, but they put them in these things. Now, keep in mind, these horses had never seen that much water in one place before, let alone being corralled like that. But they're all very placid, and they're able to transfer them off and brought them back to America. Here a year later at the New Jersey State Fair, one of the horses that eventually was lent out to Buffalo Bill Cody for his Wild West show at one point. And then the book. It was originally started as a kind of a travelogue feature in Women's Home Companion magazine. and he compiled it all into a hardcover book, which is still available today. The Davenport Arabian Horse Conservancy, still in existence, just recently published a second annotated quest detailing all the in-between stuff of that whole experience. And then the old veteran from the Saba Alis and his, I don't even try to pronounce that, horse that we purchased. Anyway, this leads me to Pearl Willard Gere, who, if you guys saw my previous presentation on Oregon Infidels, this is Homer's cousin, one of the Geres. His father was Homer's mother's brother. And by this time, Liberal University was defunct, and Gere was working as a journalist through his connections with his cousin back in New York. And he became engaged while he was at Liberal University. This is the staff here with Sophia Wolf, who was daughter of the Adolph Wolf, who ran the hardware store in town. Right here is Alice Davenport, who is a typing instructor at Liberal University, Homer's sister. Anyway, and here's Adolph Wolf and Sons Hardware when the building was still being built. Now it's the home of Main Street Bistro and quite a great restaurant. So let's see how this works. This all led up for me finding the only known clip of film of Davenport, because turns out that when Gere was interviewing Commodore Perry before he was going on a second expedition to the Arctic to try to find the North Pole, he says, we're all ready to go, except we need a ship surgeon. And Gere says, well, my buddy Lou Wolf, Sophia's brother, who they both attended medical school in Portland, Gere dropped out, but Louis got his degree. He says, yeah, he's a doctor. He'd love to go on this thing. So he says, oh, great, he's going. So he ends up going off to the Arctic with, Perry. And so I find this film on the national, I think it's the Library of Congress collection of the departure of Perry and the Roosevelt from New York. They named the ship Roosevelt. And it's basically like 2 minutes of people getting on the ship. And here, I'll run it here, one right after another. And I was watching this, and most of them were all bowler hats and whatnot. But then this one guy comes in, and he's not wearing the typical voter, but he's wearing this cowboyish hat, and he's got this drawing pad under his arm. And so, this is Homer. So Homer, yeah, he's going to go see the launch of a fellow Silvertonian. I did a similar thing when I went to Cape Canaveral and watched my classmate Don Pettit go up to the space station. So here's a detail of Homer again. So that was the only thing. Now, in the Mutavision archives, there's a list of 2 films that Homer also had done for that company, but they don't exist anymore. Apparently they were scrapped years later. Anyway, long story short, Sophie and Pearl were engaged to be married. Sophie supposedly said, I'm not going to marry you until my brother is safely back. You sent him off to his death, blah, 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 because they're incommunicado for 2.5 years. Well, when they finally came back, she said, okay, I'll marry you. So here, Miss Sophie Wolf and Earl, the editor, obviously, no one would be named Pearl. It was a guy. So he changed it to Earl. Willard Gere of Silverton, Oregon, were married yesterday in the reception room of New York City Hall by Mayor McClellan, grandson of the Civil War general. Mr. Gere is the cousin of Homer Davenport, the cartoonist, and the latter was one of the witnesses of the ceremony, Louis J. Wolf being the other. And so this is like a New York Times article. So Silverton kids get married in the mayor's office. How cool is that? I don't know how that keeps coming back, but anyway, Sophie died 10 months later. Cut to the chase. She's buried up here down at Riverview, and this is the Wolf family plot. So that was kind of a sad story. And Pearl ended up changing his name to Willard Carey, went into vaudeville, and Pearl, chirped like a cricket. He was known as the human sound effects man. So, and this is Homer's place in New Jersey, and a friend of his, Frederick Remington. When someone visited the Remingtons, they would have a little sketch pad, and they would draw little sketches of the visitors, or self-portraits or whatnot. And so this is the one that Homer drew of Fred Remington. These two camping together up in upstate New York. And here's one that Remington drew of Homer. And what's amazing is he got this little smirk on his face, like this kind of, funny, because everything I've read about Homer, he was this very vivacious and jovial guy, but all the pictures, he just looks like this dour sourpuss all the time. But apparently in person, he was, quite vivacious. And here's another shot. This is from his first book, an interview with Senator Hanna, and there's smiles, and he's got a hatchet, and he's got this stiletto, But the guy in the background here, second cousin Warren Fairbanks, Republican, Indiana, Teddy Roosevelt's vice president. So they were together. So I contacted their archives in Bloomington, Indiana, and found, again, 4 letters that Homer wrote to his cousin Fairbanks. And he was invited, apparently, to a big soiree that he was tendering for, they're both lame ducks now, him and Roosevelt, to celebrate Roosevelt's, presidency. And so he's replying to say, I'm very sorry to say that Daisy and I have been living separately for 2 years, quite uncertain. We can't come, and he says, basically, to have both of us at a function would be a mockery, blah, blah, blah. So, and this was dated, December 12th, 1908. Well, in the archives in Indiana, I found this newspaper clipping, from like a week or so later. Mr. Davenport, he went to the thing after all, one of the esteemed guests of the dinner recently tendered by President and Mrs. Roosevelt by Vice President and Mrs. Fairbanks, managed to get in a few words of the desirability of the Arabian stallion for long distance stunts in the Army. Homer has a quaint way of going about this. What will the rake-off be, Homer? Well, it's kind of a nasty little dig. But so he went. He didn't attend with Daisy. They separated by then. And here's another picture with Taft and Fairbanks looking to jump over the balloon, the presidential nomination. We all know that Taft got it. He was kind of handpicked by Roosevelt. And there's another shot of Taft dropping out the window. Governor Foraker from Indiana, because he's got his chained in with the Standard Oil thing around his neck. So it was kind of interesting. You can read the whole story of that stuff. And here they are, Joseph and Taft. And these are some of the images that we recently acquired at the Silverton Country Historical Society. This is kind of neat because, again, McKinley is relegated to just a little childlike figure, and the big boss is here at the desk. But what's is kind of neat, because here's another cartoonist, Frederick Oper, and he drew the trusts, and then Hannah is this, housemaid or whatever, and then McKinley again is a little kid, and he had a whole series of strips, Little Willie, and once McKinley got assassinated, it kind of cut into that gig. So they stopped doing that. And the same with Homer's second book, came out about 6 months before the assassination. So his book, the original, is very rare and hard to come by. And here's another shot with Frederick Oper, stealing from Homer again, if you will, the dollar marked fabric. And they're too rich for me. And the common people was his guy that he drew to represent the average person. And then here's a picture of the common people again with Oper, and then a post-Hearst cartoon that Homer drew of Hearst smacking the common people in the face. Because he drew a number of, vicious anti-Hearst cartoons, later on during this period after he left Hearst. It's incredible. Here's another one. This is one William Jennings Bryan, best known today as the prosecutor of the Scopes monkey trial, ran for president 3 times. This is his 3rd time around. And as you can see from the picture here, he's trying to milk a cow of business interests with a 4-legged chair and a watering can with boxing gloves on. And if anyone's tried to milk a cow, they kind of relate to that. And here's Uncle Sam just kind of laughing at the whole thing. And there he's again, and then here he is again, trying to get the labor vote, and we got Hearst in the background, this other guy trying to throw in, break the water to scare the fish away. And the populist candidate, Thomas E. Watson, noted racist from Georgia, and then Hearst apparently were opposing him, and he's got the anti-injunction Gompers for Samuel Gompers, the head of the American Federation of Labor. Okay, well, let me go through all these things. Another Hearst shot, and I'll just go ahead and zip on through to these things. Well, Anna Zeta, Homer's girlfriend after he left Daisy, involved in her nutrition cult. These are two paintings that Harry Franklin Waltman did of Homer that are in a private collection. I'd love to find out where those are. This is our most recent acquisition that the museum bought in Silverton. I was contacted by a guy, and this cartoon was massively reproduced and is in one of 10 Davenport cartoons included in the book, A Cartoon History of Roosevelt's Career. And this is like when they found out, the animals found out Roosevelt's coming to Africa. And here they are. They're running away. The monkey's up here with the ladder, and oh my God, what's going on? You know, so I thought that was kind of interesting. And the animals are incredibly detailed, and they're all very, you can identify them all, you know, kind of the anthropomorphic monkey here. But what's really blew me away is when, you know, not only getting this cartoon, the original in our museum, it was the source of one of the first animated cartoons ever made, which I would love to show, but we probably don't have time. But this is the end frame, because it had the monkey jumping up and down. Oh my God, look who's coming. You know, he runs up the tree and then see a little dot in the distance, and it eventually comes up and there's a grinning Teddy Roosevelt with his gun. So I'm thinking, not positive, but pretty sure it was done by early animated pioneer J.R. Bray out of New York, when it started the first cartoon studio, animated cartoon. So I'm going to skip through that. Homer was hired by A.G. Spalding to illustrate his history of baseball. And then another thing of his father, his autobiography, The Country Boy, came out in 1910. And then here's a picture of, he drew on his grandfather's wall, which is still in existence, you know, basically from this old porch, I see the best view I've ever seen. And let me run through. The bottom line is, like maybe a year before Davenport died of pneumonia, he receives this telegram from Hearst, basically, Davy, come home, Hearst, because he was in dire straits financially at the time, going through a bad divorce. The wife, you know, Daisy wanted a lot of money and he was almost broke. So anyway, went back to Hearst. And then a big chunk of ice got in front of the ship and went down, and Homer died 2 weeks later because he was waiting for 7 hours in the rain on the docks to interview the survivors, and caught his death literally, and dies in the cult leader's home from pneumonia. She wasn't really a cult leader, that's a spiritualist, but that's another story. Homer's family tended to be towards the spiritualist angle of free thought, which if anyone saw my earlier presentation kind of rocked that. Anyway, here's Homer's funeral that Hearst paid for, a big elaborate affair. Here's the Universal Liberty building, memory building here, and this is pretty much looks the same today, except the street's paved now and the cars are newer. And now he's going through onto the graveyard, and then they made this memorial to him. They were going to build a large fountain, but they during the fundraising campaign, World War I happened, and they cut to the chase and just made this new marker instead. And the only remains of the Davenport place was this Pfizer Werner Lambert factory that was built on the property. Nothing left there now, but a lot here at Deercrest, just south of Silverton. It's a Century Farm, still an active endeavor. And there's the view looking back from Homer's view. And then again, a horse is a horse, of course. And who knows about a horse? Well, it turns out that this horse is actually named Bamboo Harvester, called Mr. Ed in the TV series. Turns out to be the great-great-grandson of one of the very first horse that was gifted to Homer back in the day, in that day in Aleppo, Waduda. Incredible. So anyway, I'm going to wrap up real quick by saying Torch of Reason. Like I mentioned, this was the weekly newspaper of the Liberal University, published for 7 years from 1870. So I got it right here. 96 to 103. Well, I'm starting a Kickstarter project. to fund this getting digitized and added to the Oregon Digital Newspaper Program, so that everyone will be able to, dig into the infidel newspaper that came out of Silverton, Oregon, back in the day. So news on that, you can check that out on my website. Like I said, I got books here, cartoon book, Dollar of the Man, T.W. Davenport, and thank you.
Gus, we're not going to have much time for questions, but we have about 10 minutes. We can kind of
Okay.
through. The question I had, the doctor that wrote the book about how to have a genius.
Yeah,
And
Troll, yeah.
He was, and so definitely allowed this young man to have the life that really was a pivotal point in his life. But he looked like he believed in washing your hands very early.
Oh yeah,
Co-
yeah, yeah. A lot of these guys they didn't really have the germ theory thing down yet, but they just kind of anecdotally noticed, if you will, they tended to scrub up, and then later on they started using carbolic acid pretty regular, spraying things down that way.
And was he from the East, this
Yeah.
doctor?
Yeah. But his books are available on Google Books, which has been a real boon for me, because I've, especially with the infidel thing, because Freethinking out of Chicago, that they covered the Oregon infidels extensively, and the same with some of the Davenport stuff. His books, both of the Arabian Horse and the Country Boy, are available on Google Books as well, and so you can download those and read those online if you want. And our museum sells them too.
Hale has a question here at Friendly House. Come on up, Hale.
I think I heard the word progressive in your talk earlier. Teddy Roosevelt is called a progressive, but
by our standards, we're judging him.
Yeah,
but it's not a progressive. I agree with that.
Right.
But I was referring to his father, T.W. Davenport, as being a progressive politician,
right.
who actually was a progressive politician from our current standing. He wrote extensively about the slavery question in Oregon, for example, recollections of an Indian agent, just eviscerated the BIA from that period of time. But yeah, I agree with Teddy Roosevelt was, a mixed blessing in many regards.
Right.
But these men were all, people of their period. Teddy Roosevelt thought nothing of going out and blowing away animals. Homer,
he killed more than 2,000. If you go through his papers, he shot more than 2,000 animals.
I don't doubt it.
He
I
thought
don't doubt it a bit.
writing down.
Yeah. But anyway, the point being is that he and Davenport were friends, whatever we can take from that. Davenport was definitely not a hunter, even though he did do that piece that probably at Hearst's direction. He had written other pieces, like, for example, the one that I showed with he's coming, with Roosevelt coming to Africa with the animals up in the tree. That original cartoon that we have in our museum was dedicated by Homer to his eldest daughter, Mildred, and basically said to my daughter Mildred, who understands that it is bad to support the wanton slaughter of God's creatures, or something to that effect, in the introduction. So even though he was a friend of Roosevelt's, I think they must have agreed to disagree on, at least on the hunting and the animal.
Okay. So at this time there was a big conflict between Hearst and Roosevelt.
Oh, I know.
Yeah, that Hearst was going after Roosevelt for soliciting campaign contributions from Standard Oil, while at the same time pretending to be an antitrust agitator. So where did Davenport stand in between? Did he quit Hearst because he was tired of Hearst, or did he quit Hearst because he was tired of being caught in the middle of this fight?
Well, I don't know. It's hard to say why he quit. All I know, he might have just simply quit because he could make more money being a lecturer. He was still a cartoonist, and became a syndicated cartoonist for primarily the Republican newspapers. But once he got that gig with the lecture thing, that was his main moneymaker. And then later on, the Arabian Horses, because he started to make a lot of money with that, and he was hobnobbing with a lot of the rich and powerful. Albert Spalding, the sporting goods magnate, who basically took him in and hired him to do the illustrations for the baseball book.
That's a wonderful book. You can still get
Albert,
that one too.
there's other
Thank you.
questions. Okay, there's a question from Joyce. Come on in, Joyce.
Gus, can you think of any example of any major election in which was actually swayed by political cartoons?
Well, possibly the 1904 election that I mentioned with the Davenport cartoon would be a good example, I think, because you know, the guy that was running against him was kind of an unknown. It wasn't uh, the prosecutor guy. It was Judge something, I forgot, but very obscure politician, and he probably didn't have a chance anyway. So the cartoon maybe minimally helped, but that's the only one I could think of right off the hand. Although Nash was a strong supporter of Ulysses S. Grant, and some of the cartoons that he did in Grant support may well have assisted in you know, Grant getting elected.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Guys, we're out of time, but we're gonna, if you would stick around for afterthoughts, we'd love to,
Sure.
I think, continue the discussion. This was